It looks like learners will need to endure crowded classrooms for a little while longer. The Department of Basic Education has told Parliament that the crisis looks far from over as it doesn't have the required funds to build additional classrooms. Minister Angie Motshekga says part of the problem is common in schools that serve informal settlements due to immigration. At the same time, money has also become tight as it has gone towards rebuilding, in fact, schools in flood-ravaged areas in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. Let's look more on the impact of this now with equal education researcher Katherine Sutherland. Katherine, thank you so much for your time this evening. I mean, the question comes as a result of, questions that were being asked about Finetown Secondary School in Gauteng, but I'm keen to hear from you. Briefly tell us, how bad is the situation countrywide?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. We unfortunately don't really know how bad the situation is countrywide. So EE conducted research between the years of 2019 and 2020. And part of what we found during this research was that the data that the government uses to detect overcrowding and also to determine whether schools can get new resources is not very accurate. They use overly simplified ratios based on the number of classrooms, the number of teachers, and the number of learners. And it doesn't take into account how schools actually operate on a day-to-day basis. The GDE at the time stated that in the 9 schools that we did research in Itwatwa, out of those 9 schools, they said that none of the classrooms were too full. They said that there was only a learner-to-teacher ratio of 30 learners to 1 teacher, and only 35% of teachers were overworked. But our research showed something very, very different. We showed about over 70% of the classes that we measured, which were 751, by the way, had over 40 learners, and 7 out of the 9 schools were over capacity and had 66% of classrooms that were way too small. So essentially what we're looking at here is that overcrowding is probably a much bigger issue than the government is acknowledging.
And one of the things, as you say, it's not about the number, as you say, of learners in a class to a teacher, but it also impacts the quality of the education that is then being delivered to those learners.
Absolutely. We see the effects of overcrowding not in isolation. So, for example, the effect of overcrowding during the COVID-19 pandemic meant that learners were attending school on a rotational timetable, whereas much better resource schools could send their learners back to school full time. We saw massive learning losses during that time, and last week, the NEC Panyaza Lesufi noted that still 38 schools are attending on a rotational basis, still today. We also see furniture being overused and infrastructure breaking. Mobile classrooms are overcrowded and therefore breaking, and they're overpopulated, which means that they're especially vulnerable to extreme weather conditions. Learners are falling behind, teachers are overwhelmed. It's really, there's nothing great about it.
And you talk about something I was going to get to, because the recovery program is currently underway, and I'm sure learners are looking to recover lost time here, but these budget shortages are having a severe impact on that. What would you say then, needs to be done, particularly from a schools level? I'll get to the department's level in just a moment, but the schools level, in order to ensure that they try to weather the storms and not disadvantage the learners while they're waiting for these budget allocations?
From a school level, it's quite difficult for schools to adapt to overcrowding in the way that they think is best. For example, when a school decides that they're no longer going to accept more learners, they often get resources taken away from them. If a school decides that they're going to add a new school language, a new subject, but the GDE doesn't recognize it as a subject that necessarily requires a new teacher, they may not get that. So it's really difficult for a school to not only report overcrowding, because often the government and the state will look at the learner-to-teacher ratio and say, well, actually you don't have overcrowding because your learner-to-teacher ratio is only 30 to 1, whereas in reality, learner-to-teacher ratios are 40 and over. So it's really difficult to tackle the issue of overcrowding from a school level.
And let's then, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this one, because SATU, for example, Mokwena Maluleka from SATU was, saying to one publication that the only solution is for the department to reprioritize its budget and cut down on its bureaucratic stuff, which, the union is also blaming, for example, for the classrooms that have not been built up to now. Would you say that that would help at all?
I think that is definitely part of the solution. We, as Equal Education, have 4 key recommendations. The one definitely acknowledges that there are severe budget constraints within the departments, but unfortunately we see there are predicted future budget cuts as well by Treasury itself, which they've acknowledged will lead to more overcrowding. But the resources we actually do have aren't being used particularly well. In fact, the Department of Infrastructure, which is the implementing agent for a lot of school projects, is widely known for wasteful expenditure and under expenditure, and it's really important to crack down on that. In terms of budget that we do spend, it's also important to be spending in a targeted manner. So we need to target schools that are overcrowded. But we can't do that unless we know that schools are overcrowded. So we need to be looking at the causes and the prevalence of overcrowding. We need to be measuring it better, looking at schools in a much more holistic way. We're also looking at infrastructure as our second recommendation. And I think that the comment that the minister made in terms of not being able to fix overcrowding or to just alleviate overcrowding because of the recent floods is an unfair one to make. I think a trade-off between fixing schools that were damaged in flooding versus fixing overcrowding is just, it's not fair. We are required to do both. In terms of the in-migration, we show in our report that actually there are a lot of school communities that grow very predictably throughout the years. In fact, the Center for Child Law published a report showing that the government uses very simplified measures in terms of predicting not only in-migration but also population growth, and there are much better ways to do that.
All right, Katherine, pardon me for coming in there. Thank you so much for your time this evening. I'm keen for us to have another conversation in the future that looks at this data collection, because as you say, it is important, it is critical into how resources then become allocated. But let's leave it there for now. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That's Equal Education researcher Katherine Sutherland talking about the issue of overcrowding in classrooms.